Honestly, some
30,000
parents
feet
just can't
above the
handle their
freezing
kids in
Pacific,
public.
a commercial airliner was
We need a
plunging
fighter
into a
pilot
deadly
immediately.
dive.
Is there
In
a fighter
seat
pilot on
12F
board?
sat a scruffy, exhausted single father, mocked by passengers just hours before. No one knew the battered duffel bag at his feet hid a past that commanded the skies. The fluorescent lights of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport flickered with an unforgiving glare. At Gate D4, boarding for Flight 882 to Anchorage was delayed, and the collective patience of the passengers had long since evaporated. Standing near the back of the boarding line was Thomas Callahan, holding the hand of his 6-year-old daughter, Chloe. Thomas looked entirely out of place among the business travelers and affluent tourists. He wore a faded, grease-stained canvas jacket. His work boots were scuffed from months of grueling labor at a dockyard, and shadows of profound exhaustion hung beneath his sharp blue eyes. Chloe, clutching a well-worn stuffed rabbit, leaned against his leg, coughing softly into her sleeve. "Almost there, sweetie," Thomas murmured, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. He adjusted the heavy canvas duffel bag slung over his shoulder. It was the only luggage they owned. A few feet away, standing in the priority boarding lane, Victoria Croft was having a remarkably bad morning. As the billionaire CEO of Croft Aerospace, one of the nation's top defense contracting firms, she was accustomed to flying exclusively on her company's Gulfstream G650. But a catastrophic hydraulic failure had grounded her jet that morning, forcing her security detail to scramble for the last available seat on a commercial flight to Alaska for a critical summit at Elmendorf Air Force Base. Dressed in an immaculate charcoal Prada suit, Victoria tapped her manicured fingers against her phone, silently cursing the airline's inefficiency. When she glanced up, her sharp, calculating eyes landed on Thomas. She watched as a woman in a designer trench coat dramatically sidestepped the father and daughter, wrinkling her nose as if proximity to their poverty might be contagious. Thomas didn't react. His posture remained rigidly straight, his chin tucked down, a stance Victoria recognized from her years dealing with military contractors. It was the stance of a man heavily disciplined, yet deliberately making himself small. Once aboard the Boeing 737-800, Thomas and Chloe squeezed into seats 12E and 12F. Victoria, due to the last-minute booking, was relegated to 12C, directly across the aisle. She settled in, opening her laptop, but found her attention drifting back to the pair. Before takeoff, Chloe's cough worsened, a dry, rattling sound. Thomas flagged down a passing flight attendant, a sharp-featured woman with a heavy layer of makeup whose name tag read Brenda. "Excuse me," Thomas asked politely. "Could I get a cup of warm water and maybe an extra blanket for my daughter? The vents are blowing pretty cold air on her." Brenda paused, her eyes sweeping over Thomas's frayed collar and calloused hands. Her customer service smile didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, beverage service doesn't begin until we reach cruising altitude. And blankets are strictly reserved for our first-class cabin. You should have dressed her warmer." Before Thomas could formulate a diplomatic reply, Victoria snapped her laptop shut. "Brenda, is it?" Victoria's voice was crisp, slicing through the ambient cabin noise. "I happen to know aviation regulations require you to maintain a safe temperature. Furthermore, human decency requires you to not be insufferable. Bring the child a blanket. Take the one from my seat if you must." Brenda flushed a deep crimson, stammering an apology, and hurried away. Thomas leaned across the aisle, his eyes meeting Victoria's. "Thank you, ma'am. You didn't have to do that." "I have zero tolerance for incompetence," Victoria replied coolly, though her gaze lingered on him. There was something intensely focused in his eyes. "Where are you heading?" "Anchorage," Thomas said softly, wrapping his canvas jacket around Chloe's shivering shoulders. "Got a lead on a mechanic job up there? Starting over?" Victoria nodded, returning to her work, though the brief interaction planted a seed of curiosity in her mind. The flight took off smoothly, piercing through the heavy Seattle drizzle, but the tranquility was deceptively fragile. 90 minutes into the flight, as the aircraft crossed into the turbulent skies over the Gulf of Alaska, the weather radar went black. A freak, hyper-localized storm front, a meteorological anomaly, swallowed the Boeing 737. Without warning, the aircraft dropped out of the sky. It wasn't a standard patch of rough air. The plane plummeted hundreds of feet in seconds. Overhead bins flew open, raining luggage down onto screaming passengers. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, dangling like yellow ghosts in the dimly lit cabin. Chloe screamed, terrified, and Thomas instantly unbuckled his own seatbelt to wrap his body over hers, shielding her from a hard plastic suitcase that crashed into the seat beside them. The plane leveled out with a violently shuddering groan, but the engines whined at an erratic, terrifying pitch. The cabin lights flickered off, replaced by the eerie red glow of emergency lighting. Then came the sound that froze the blood of every passenger on board. The intercom crackled, and a panicked, breathless voice echoed through the cabin. "Mayday, Mayday, this is First Officer Simmons. If there is a pilot on board, anyone with multi-engine flight experience, please ring the call bell immediately. I repeat, we have a catastrophic medical emergency in the cockpit. The captain is unresponsive." Panic erupted. Passengers began to hyperventilate. The flight attendants, terrified themselves, looked around wildly. In seat 12F, Thomas Callahan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He took a deep, stabilizing breath, kissed Chloe's forehead, and unbuckled his seatbelt. Thomas stood up, his tall frame suddenly commanding the chaotic space of the economy cabin. The hunched, defeated posture of a struggling single father vanished completely. His movements were precise, efficient, and completely devoid of panic. "Chloe, close your eyes and hold on to Mr. Rabbit," Thomas told his daughter, his voice eerily calm. "Daddy has to go to work for a few minutes." He stepped into the aisle, nearly colliding with Brenda, the flight attendant, who was gripping a seatback with white knuckles. "I need to get to the cockpit," Thomas said firmly. Brenda looked at him, her eyes wide with terror, but her inherent bias still flared. She saw the grease stains, the scuffed boots, the frayed jacket. "Sir, sit down. Are you crazy?" "We need a real pilot, not someone who plays flight simulators." "Move out of my way," Thomas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a lethal, absolute authority that made the hairs on the back of Victoria Croft's neck stand up. It was a tone she had only ever heard from four-star generals and elite special operators. "I can't let you up there," Brenda shrieked, blocking the aisle. "It's a federal offense to—" He said, "Move!" Victoria was suddenly out of her seat, standing shoulder to shoulder with Thomas. She glared at the flight attendant with the full weight of a billionaire who regularly destroyed corporate rivals before breakfast. "I am Victoria Croft, CEO of Croft Aerospace. My company designed the avionics mainframe sitting in that cockpit right now. If this man says he can fly the plane, you are going to open that door, or I will ensure you spend the rest of your life answering for the blood of 200 people." Brenda blinked, overwhelmed, and finally stepped aside. Thomas didn't waste a second thanking Victoria. He simply moved forward, sprinting down the aisle to the reinforced cockpit door. He pounded out a rapid, rhythmic knock. The door clicked open. First Officer Simmons, a young man who looked barely 25, was pale as a ghost, tears streaming down his face. Beside him, the captain was slumped violently against the controls, unconscious, a victim of a massive stroke. "Get him off the yoke," Thomas barked, squeezing into the cramped space. He didn't wait for the stunned co-pilot to react. Thomas grabbed the heavy, unconscious captain by the shoulders, hauling him back and strapping him securely into the jump seat with a sheer physical strength that belied his lean frame. Thomas slid into the left seat, the captain's chair. He didn't hesitate. His hands danced across the complex instrument panels with blinding speed, neutralizing the erratic inputs that had been caused by the unconscious captain slumping on the controls. "Who are you?" Simmons stammered, staring at the scruffy man in the pilot's seat. "Name's Thomas," he replied, his eyes scanning the primary flight display. "Status report. Now, sun. We lost autopilot in the drop. The storm front fried the weather radar, and we deviated wildly off course to avoid a cell. I don't know where we are. GPS is giving conflicting coordinates, and the right engine is surging. I've only got 300 hours on this airframe. I can't fly it dead stick in a storm." "You're not going to," Thomas said, his hands taking firm, muscular control of the yoke. "Pull up the manual navigation charts. Switch comms to guard frequency 121.5. We need to find out whose airspace we just stumbled into." Before Simmons could touch the radio, a deafening roar shook the aircraft. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of military-grade jet engines. Thomas looked out the left window. Emerging from the thick, dark clouds, flying less than 50 feet from the airliner's wingtip, was the sleek, menacing gray silhouette of a Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor. A second Raptor flanked the right side. The radio cracked to life, blaring an automated, highly distorted voice over the emergency frequency. Unidentified Boeing 737, this is the United States Air Force. You have violated restricted military airspace under the jurisdiction of NORAD. You are unresponsive to ATC. Divert your course immediately to heading 090 or you will be intercepted and engaged. Acknowledge immediately. Simmons began to sob. They think we're hijacked. We're off course near Elmendorf's classified testing grounds. They're going to shoot us down. Nobody is shooting anybody today, Thomas said coldly. He reached out, grabbing the radio microphone. He didn't use the standard commercial aviation protocols. He didn't identify as Flight 882. He depressed the transmit button, his eyes locking onto the F-22 hovering off his left wing. He could see the pilot's helmet looking right back at him. Viper lead, this is commercial airliner 737. I am squawking 7,700 for a medical emergency. You are sitting in my blind spot, so back off my wing by 100 yards before I catch your wash and roll this bird. There was a stunned silence on the radio. The military pilots were not used to being spoken to with such aggressive, tactical familiarity by a civilian pilot. Airliner, identify yourself, the F-22 pilot demanded, dropping the automated voice, sounding confused but tense. We need a verified ID, or we are escalating the intercept. Thomas took a breath. For 5 years, he had buried his past. He had hidden from the world, lived in shadows, and worked for pennies to keep his daughter safe after the accident that ruined his life. But he couldn't hide today. He leaned into the microphone. This is Major Thomas Callahan, former commander of the 422nd Test and Evaluation Squadron at Nellis. Call sign, Wraith. Now back off my damn wing. Static hissed through the cockpit. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was no response. First Officer Simmons held his breath. Then, over the radio, the F-22 pilot's voice returned. The aggression was completely gone, replaced by a shock that bordered on reverence. Wraith? Good God. It's a ghost. Outside the window, the F-22 Raptor sharply pitched up, smoothly breaking away from the dangerously close formation. As it banked, the fighter jet dipped its left wing in a crisp, undeniable maneuver. It was a military salute. Copy that, Wraith. It is an honor, sir, the pilot's voice crackled, filled with awe. We have you on radar. Escort is secured. We will guide you down. In the cabin, Victoria Croft watched through the open cockpit door, her jaw slightly parted in pure disbelief. The poor, scruffy single dad she had just defended wasn't just a pilot. He was an absolute legend. The cockpit of Flight 882 was a claustrophobic box of blinking amber warnings and the deafening roar of the storm outside. But for Thomas Callahan, it was the most familiar place in the world. The shockwave of his revealed identity still hung heavily in the air, but the luxury of awe was short-lived. The Boeing 737-800 shuddered violently as a massive downdraft slammed into the fuselage, dropping them another 400 feet in a matter of seconds. Standing just outside the reinforced cockpit door, Victoria Croft gripped the bulkhead to keep from falling. Her mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of classified briefings she had read years ago. Wraith, Major Thomas Callahan. He wasn't just a pilot. He had been the United States Air Force's premier test pilot for the Next Generation Air Dominance program. He was the man who could make a brick fly gracefully. But Victoria also remembered the scandal. 5 years ago, an experimental prototype equipped with an experimental targeting matrix manufactured by her biggest rival, Meridian Dynamics, had suffered a catastrophic in-flight failure over the Mojave Desert. Thomas had managed to crash land the multi-million-dollar jet away from a populated civilian area, saving hundreds of lives on the ground, but breaking his own back in the process. Meridian Dynamics, desperate to save their stock price and their multi-billion-dollar Department of Defense contract, had falsified the telemetry data. They blamed the crash on pilot error. They crucified Thomas Callahan. Disgraced, stripped of his pension, and blacklisted from the aviation industry, Thomas had quietly vanished. A year later, his wife passed away from a sudden, aggressive illness, leaving him entirely alone with an infant daughter and mounting medical debt. The military-industrial complex had chewed him up and spat him out into seat 12F. Simmons, snap out of it! Thomas's voice cracked like a whip, pulling Victoria back to the present. He wrestled the yoke, his biceps bulging beneath his frayed canvas jacket. I need you in the game. What's the temperature on the right engine? First Officer Simmons blinked, wiping tears from his face, and forced his eyes to the engine indicating and crew alerting system, ICAS, screen. EGT is spiking, sir. Exhaust gas temperature is passing 900 degrees Celsius. We have a severe vibration in the N1 fan. Ice ingestion, Thomas said grimly. The storm cell we flew through choked the intake. It's chewing up the turbine blades. Shut it down. Cut fuel to engine 2. Sir, if we lose the right engine in this weather, we won't have the thrust to punch through the headwinds to Anchorage, Simmons protested, his hands hovering over the fuel cutoff switches, trembling. If we don't shut it down, the compressor is going to stall, the engine will explode, and it will tear the right wing off the airframe, Thomas replied, his voice terrifyingly calm. I won't tell you twice, son. Cut the fuel. Simmons swallowed hard, reached down, and pulled the fire switch for the right engine. The 737 yawed violently to the right as 50% of their thrust vanished instantly. The asymmetrical drag tried to flip the heavy commercial airliner on its back. Thomas was already moving, stomping heavily on the left rudder pedal and banking the yoke to counteract the deadly spin. His movements were a masterclass in aerodynamics, fluid, muscular, and perfectly timed. Viper led. This is Wraith. Thomas spoke into the radio, his eyes scanning the artificial horizon. We just lost our right side. We are heavy, we are slow, and we are dropping. Anchorage is out of the question. What's the weather looking like at Elmendorf? Outside, the two F-22 Raptors tucked in tighter, their Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines glowing bright orange in the gloom as they matched the airliner's agonizingly slow speed. Wraith, this is Viper led, Captain Bradley Hayes replied, his tone laced with heavy concern. Elmendorf is currently experiencing whiteout conditions. Visibility is less than a quarter mile. Crosswinds at 45 knots. The base commander is scrambling emergency crews, but they are advising you to ditch in the Cook Inlet. Negative. Viper. I have 142 souls on board, and water temps down there will kill them in 3 minutes. I'm putting this bird on the concrete at Elmendorf. Sir, with respect, you are flying a crippled, single-engine commercial, heavy, into a blizzard. The glide slope is completely blind. I don't need to see it, Captain. I just need you to lead me to the door. Thomas adjusted his grip on the yoke. Get in front of me. Light up your afterburners. I'm going to follow your heat signature right down the pipe. There was a brief pause on the radio. It was an insanely dangerous maneuver. If the F-22 slowed down too much, it would stall. If Thomas came in too fast, he would rear-end a fully armed fighter jet. Copy that, Wraith. Moving into position. It's an honor to fly with you, sir. Victoria Croft watched the sleek F-22 slide directly in front of the Boeing's nose, its twin exhausts flaring into brilliant, blinding spears of blue and orange fire. It was a beacon in the darkness. Victoria turned away from the cockpit. She walked swiftly down the aisle, her high heels clicking softly against the floorboards. The cabin was a scene of muted terror. Passengers were clutching each other, praying, or staring blankly into the void. She found seat 12F. Chloe was curled tightly into a ball, clutching her stuffed rabbit, shivering and whimpering quietly. Victoria, the ruthless billionaire who had dismantled entire corporate empires without a second thought, knelt on the floor of the economy cabin. She didn't care about the grime on the carpet or the wrinkles in her Prada suit. She reached out and gently pulled the little girl into her arms. Is my daddy coming back? Chloe whispered, her eyes wide and fearful. Your daddy, Victoria said softly, holding the child tight, is the best pilot in the world, and he is going to get us all on the ground. I promise you. The descent into Elmendorf Air Force Base was a grueling test of physics and human endurance. The Boeing 737 was not designed to be flown on a single engine through a Category 4 winter squall. Every gust of wind threatened to push the heavy aircraft out of the sky. Inside the cockpit, Thomas was drenched in sweat. The physical exertion required to keep the plane level without autopilot and with asymmetrical thrust was immense. His left leg was trembling from holding the rudder pedal down with over 100 pounds of constant pressure. Altitude, 3,000 feet, Simmons called out, his voice finally stabilizing as Thomas's icy demeanor anchored him. Airspeed is 150 knots. We are riding the stall warning, sir. The control column began to violently shake in Thomas's hands, the stick shaker, an aggressive mechanical warning that the wings were losing lift and the plane was about to fall out of the sky. "Hold her together," Thomas muttered, fighting the yoke. "Give me 10 degrees of flaps. Don't drop the gear until I say. We need to stay clean as long as possible to minimize drag." Over the radio, a new, gruff voice cut through the static. "POTUS action." It was General Richard Iron Hastings, the base commander at Elmendorf and a former wingman of Thomas's from their days flying F-15s in combat. "Wraith, this is Elmendorf Tower. Hastings speaking. I never thought I'd hear your voice on my frequency again, Tommy." "Save the reunion, Richard," Thomas grunted, wrestling the plane through a violent patch of turbulence. "I'm bringing a wounded bird into your nest. I have no right engine, partial hydraulics, and a cockpit full of warning lights. Are your emergency crews in position? We have every fire truck and medical unit in Alaska lining runway 24. But Tommy, you have a 40-knot crosswind blowing straight off the mountains. You're going to have to crab it all the way down, and you won't have reverse thrust on the right side to keep you straight once you touch down. You're going to spin off the tarmac." "I'll handle it," Thomas said. "Just make sure the runway is clear." 1,000 feet, Simmons reported. "Still no visual on the runway. It's just snow, Captain." Thomas didn't correct the young first officer's use of the title. He kept his eyes locked on the twin pillars of fire from the F-22 directly ahead of them. Captain Hayes was threading the needle perfectly, guiding the massive commercial jet down the invisible glide path. "Viper lead, break off," Thomas commanded. "If I go down, I'm not taking you with me. Pull up and get clear." "Negative, Wraith. I'm taking you all the way to the threshold," the young fighter pilot replied stubbornly. "That is a direct order, Captain. Brake right now." The F-22 hesitated for a fraction of a second, then violently banked sharply to the right, disappearing into the white void, leaving Flight 882 entirely alone in the blinding snowstorm. 500 feet, Simmons whispered, gripping his seat. "Sink rate is high. Pull up, pull up." The automated GPWS system began blaring its robotic warning. Terrain, I'll pull up." "Gear down," Thomas yelled. Simmons slammed the landing gear lever downward. The heavy hydraulic thud of the wheels locking into place sent a shudder through the airframe. "Flaps full?" "Flaps full, sir." They broke through the cloud ceiling at exactly 200 feet. Suddenly, the harsh, high-intensity strobe lights of Elmendorf's runway 24 materialized out of the blizzard, dead ahead. But the runway wasn't straight in front of them. The massive crosswind was blowing them violently to the left. "Crabbing," Thomas announced. He pushed the rudder pedal hard, twisting the nose of the aircraft almost sideways, pointing it into the wind while the plane continued its forward momentum toward the runway. From the ground, the 70-ton commercial jet looked like it was flying diagonally. 50 feet, Simmons called. 40, 30, 20. "Hold on to something." Thomas braced himself. At 10 feet, Thomas executed a maneuver that only a handful of pilots in the world could pull off in a commercial airliner. He forcefully kicked the rudder to straighten the nose, perfectly aligning the wheels with the asphalt mere milliseconds before they made contact, while simultaneously dropping the upwind wing to prevent the wind from flipping them. The left main landing gear slammed onto the concrete with a bone-jarring crack. The right gear followed a second later. "Spoilers up! Brakes!" Thomas roared. Simmons deployed the speed brakes, but the nightmare was only beginning. The runway was covered in a slick layer of freezing rain and snow. As Thomas engaged the thrust reverser on the only working engine, the left one, the immense asymmetrical deceleration violently yanked the nose of the plane to the left, straight toward the muddy, snow-covered infield and a line of concrete barricades. "We're skidding!" Simmons screamed. The tires shrieked, dumping plumes of white smoke into the freezing air as the anti-skid brakes fought for traction. The massive aircraft was drifting sideways at 120 miles an hour. Thomas's jaw was clenched so tight his teeth threatened to crack. He released the left thrust reverser completely, sacrificing braking power for directional control. He stood on the right brake pedal with every ounce of strength in his body, wrestling the yoke in the opposite direction. In the cabin, passengers screamed as the G-forces threw them against their harnesses. Victoria Croft held Chloe against her chest, wrapping her own body around the child like a shield. squeezing her eyes shut as the terrifying sound of tearing metal and squealing rubber filled the air. Slowly, agonizingly, Thomas bullied the aircraft back into submission. The nose swung back toward the center line. The speed bled off. 80 knots, 50 knots, 30 knots. The Boeing 737 shuddered, groaned, and finally, with a massive jolt, came to a complete, dead stop. For 10 seconds, the only sound in the cockpit was the heavy, ragged breathing of the two men, accompanied by the wind howling outside the windshield. Thomas Callahan slowly took his hands off the yoke. His knuckles were white, his palms bleeding from where his fingernails had dug into his own skin. He looked over at the young first officer, who was staring out the window at the line of military fire trucks rushing toward them through the snow. "Good work, Simmons," Thomas said quietly, his voice a gravelly whisper. "You did good." Simmons looked back at him, tears of absolute relief streaming down his face. "You saved us! You saved all of us!" Thomas didn't answer. He simply unbuckled his harness, stood up, and opened the cockpit door. As he stepped out, the terrifying silence of the cabin was suddenly broken. It didn't start with a cheer, but with a slow, echoing clap from the back. Then another. Within seconds, the entire cabin erupted. Passengers were weeping, shouting, unbuckling their seatbelts to reach out toward him. But Thomas ignored them all. He walked straight down the aisle, his eyes locked on row 12. Victoria Croft looked up as the towering, exhausted man approached. She gently released her grip on the little girl. Chloe scrambled over the seat, launching herself into her father's arms. Thomas caught her, burying his face in her hair, closing his eyes as a single tear finally escaped and tracked down his dirt-smudged cheek. "I told you, sweetie," Thomas whispered into his daughter's ear. "Daddy just had to go to work for a few minutes." Victoria stood up, stepping into the aisle. The immaculately dressed billionaire and the disgraced, ruined pilot looked at each other amidst the chaos of the surviving passengers. She didn't see the grease stains or the frayed jacket anymore. She saw a man of unparalleled honor, a man who had been wronged by the very industry she ruled. "Major Callahan," Victoria said, her voice cutting clearly through the cheering cabin. She held out her hand. "I believe we have a great deal to discuss." The aftermath of Flight 882's miraculous landing was a blur of flashing emergency lights, freezing Alaskan wind, and stunned silence. Inside the heavily guarded perimeter of Elmendorf Air Force Base, the passengers were evacuated to a warm hangar, wrapped in thermal blankets and surrounded by medics. But Thomas Callahan was not among them. He sat in a sterile, brightly lit debriefing room deep inside the base's command center, a cup of untouched black coffee cooling on the metal table before him. Across from him sat General Richard Hastings, his face lined with a mixture of exhaustion and profound respect. Before the general could speak, the heavy steel door swung open. Victoria Croft walked in, flanked by two of her highest-ranking corporate attorneys. She had traded her ruined Prada suit for a tactical fleece borrowed from base personnel, but her commanding aura remained entirely undiminished. "General Hastings," Victoria said crisply, bypassing pleasantries, "I am placing Major Callahan under the immediate legal protection of Croft Aerospace. Furthermore, my private security detail is taking over his and his daughter's physical protection." Thomas looked up, his blue eyes bloodshot. "Victoria, you don't have to do this. I flew a plane. That's it. You saved 142 lives, including mine," Victoria corrected, her gaze locking onto his. "But more importantly, Thomas, sitting on that plane, gave me 2 hours to make some phone calls via my encrypted satellite uplink. I know exactly who put you in that coach seat. I know what Meridian Dynamics did to you 5 years ago." General Hastings sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Victoria, the Pentagon sealed that crash report. The official ruling was pilot error. Meridian Dynamics holds a $40 billion defense contract. They are untouchable." A cold, lethal smile spread across Victoria's face. "No one is untouchable when I have their source code." The twist that unraveled the greatest aviation cover-up of the decade began the very next morning. Victoria Croft did not just hire Thomas as a pilot. She unleashed the full, terrifying financial and cyber intelligence might of Croft Aerospace. Meridian Dynamics, led by their ruthless CEO, Harrison Sterling, had built their empire on the falsified telemetry data from Thomas's crash. They had blamed the human to hide a fatal flaw in their automated flight control matrix. Victoria knew that digital ghosts never truly die. She deployed a team of elite forensic data analysts to quietly purchase a defunct server farm in Virginia, the very facility Meridian Dynamics had used to wipe the original black box data 5 years prior. Through a grueling 72-hour recovery operation, Victoria's team managed to reconstruct the fragmented, deleted hard drives. The data was damning. It proved irrefutably that the experimental jet's targeting matrix had initiated a catastrophic uncommanded dive, and that Thomas Callahan had actually fought the rogue computer system to a standstill, single-handedly preventing the jet from crashing into a heavily populated Mojave suburb. 3 weeks later, the trap was sprung. Washington, D.C., was buzzing with anticipation. Inside the Dirksen Senate Office Building, the Armed Services Committee was convening to formally award Meridian Dynamics the next-generation fighter contract. Harrison Sterling sat at the witness table, exuding the smug arrogance of a man who believed he had won the world. "Mr. Sterling," the committee chairman began, adjusting his microphone, "your company's safety record has been spotless since the unfortunate pilot-induced anomaly 5 years ago. We are prepared to move forward with the CMed Ops." The heavy oak doors at the back of the hearing room pushed open, the loud clack echoing off the marble walls. Victoria Croft strode down the center aisle, a leather briefcase in her hand. Beside her walked Thomas Callahan, no longer wearing a grease-stained canvas jacket. He was dressed in an immaculate, tailored Navy suit, looking every inch the elite commander he was born to be. "Chairman, I apologize for the interruption." Victoria's voice rang out, silencing the room. "But as a primary defense contractor, I am legally obligated under the False Claims Act to present this committee with evidence of high treason and corporate fraud." Harrison Sterling's face drained of color. "What is the meaning of this? Security! Remove them!" "Sit down, Harrison," Victoria snapped, her voice like a cracking whip. She slammed a heavy file onto the committee table, along with a secure silver hard drive. This drive contains the unredacted, original telemetry data from the NGAD prototype crash 5 years ago, data that Mr. Sterling personally ordered destroyed. It proves that the Meridian flight matrix is inherently flawed and that Major Callahan was intentionally framed to protect your stock price. Chaos erupted in the chamber. Press cameras flashed violently. Sterling shot out of his chair, stammering wildly, pointing a shaking finger at Thomas. "This is a fabrication. He's a disgraced, broken pilot." Thomas finally stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't lose his temper. The discipline that had kept. Flight 882 inches. The sky now radiated from him in absolute waves of authority. "I am Major Thomas Callahan," he said, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man who had faced death and won. "And I respectfully request that the Department of Defense Inspector General place Harrison Sterling under immediate arrest for perjury, fraud, and the reckless endangerment of United States military personnel." The karma was absolute and devastating. By the end of the week, Meridian Dynamics' stock plummeted by 80%. The Pentagon canceled their contracts, and federal marshals escorted Harrison Sterling out of his corner office in handcuffs, facing decades in federal prison. The executives who had ruined Thomas's life were systematically hunted down by the Department of Justice, their careers and fortunes reduced to ash. A year later, the harsh lights of the Seattle airport were a distant memory. At the private runway of the Croft Aerospace Testing Facility, a gleaming, state-of-the-art corporate jet idled on the tarmac. Thomas Callahan sat in the left seat of the cockpit, his hands resting comfortably on the yoke. The heavy exhaustion that had once haunted his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a sharp, focused peace. In the VIP cabin behind him, Chloe sat buckled into a plush leather seat, her stuffed rabbit resting beside a brand new tablet. She was healthy, happy, and thriving. Sitting across from her, reviewing a tablet of her own, was Victoria. "Flight matrix looks solid." "Major," Victoria called out from the back, a hint of warmth in her normally authoritative tone. "Whenever you're ready to take us to Paris." "Copy that, boss." Thomas smiled, engaging the thrusters. The engine spooled up, a smooth, powerful roar that sounded like absolute freedom. He pushed the throttles forward, and the Wraith finally returned to the sky, exactly where he belonged. The world finally remembered the Wraith. Thomas Callahan, once a forgotten father in economy, reclaimed his rightful place in the sky, his honor restored by the billionaire who saw past his frayed jacket. Meridian Dynamics collapsed, their deep corporate corruption fully exposed. Today, Thomas flies not out of desperation, but with his daughter safely watching from the ground, proving that true legends can never be permanently grounded by dark deceit.
At the time of this recording, and with this small channel, I already made $500, and I didn't make $500 with YouTube ad revenue because this channel is not even monetized yet. I made $500 herself and talk your opinion, speak your opinion, and post it. The next day, if you have an opinion about something you saw on the news, take the camera and tell your opinion.
And the respect he later
about
received
something. If you
once
have
the
an
truth became
opinion
known.
about some car, if you
The
have an
story
opinion
carried
about
that
Donald
emotional
Trump, if you have
reminder
any
that
kind of
someone's
opinion
appearance,
about anything,
clothes, or
open the
current
camera
situation
and
never
speak
tell the
your
full
mind,
story
whatever
about
it's
who they
on your
are
mind. You don't
or
need the
what they've
second reason I
sacrificed.
think you should start a YouTube channel in
I think that moment of
2025 is
recognition from the
because it
pilots
doesn't matter
is what
anymore
gave
how
the
many
story such a
subscribers you
strong
have. The way
emotional
the
impact.
algorithm on YouTube works, it's
Do
so
you think
much
the people
different
around
from
him felt
2016 and
regret after realizing
2013
who he
and
really
2003,
was?
and it just makes you
Or do
feel
moments
good.
like that
And I'll
simply
give
reveal
you,
how
I'll
often
give
we
my
overlook
channel as an
others?
example. If you see this channel
And why
I'm
do you
making
think
this video
stories
on,
about
I
hidden
only have
dignity and earned
700
respect
subscribers
connect
at the
so
time
deeply
of this
with people?
recording, and with
I think stories like
it doesn't
this
even
remind us
require
to
you
treat
to make
everyone with
crazy
kindness and
video
respect,
edits. That's the
long
beauty
before we know
about it. You
anything
can
about their
simply
background.
record yourself being
If this
authentic,
story
being
stayed
true
with
to
you
yourself,
emotionally, I'd
saying
really love
your
to hear your
own
thoughts in the
opinion.
comments.
Today you can post a video
And if you
about
enjoy
anything.
emotional stories about
Just
resilience,
speak your mind,
sacrifice, and
and you
unexpected
might get
recognition,
viral, and it
feel
might
free to like and
change your
subscribe,
life. It's
only
so
if you'd
worth
like to
it.
see
The
more.
third reason why